Welcome to another episode of Always Ageless, where we bring you expert advice and real world solutions about living well at any age. I'm your host, Valerie Van de Zilver, and today we're talking about something that affects every generation: financial security and smart investment strategies. Our guest today is Scott Pilchard, founder of Western Skies Advisory, an experienced investment advisor who has helped countless individuals and families navigate wealth management, retirement planning, and financial decision making. Now, you might say, well, I'm not wealthy, so I certainly don't need a wealth manager. I can relate. But all of us have something, and all of us are getting to the age where we're going to need to make our money work better or longer for us. And Scott's going to give us some of those tips. So we're not just talking about money, we're talking about how to make your money work for you. Whether you're downsizing, you're planning for your future, or you're simply just looking for better ways to invest, whatever it is that you have. So one of Scott's areas of expertise is DSTs. Now, what is a DST? It's a Delaware Statutory Trust. It's a unique investment tool that many people have never even heard of, but it can be a game changer in the right situations for the right people and if used properly. And if you've never heard of it, you're not alone. So that's why we brought Scott on today. So whether you're a seasoned investor, you're just getting started, you don't even know what any of this is about, and you certainly don't think you need a wealth manager, well, you do. So turn up your volume if you're driving, grab a cup of tea, and let's get started. Scott, thank you very much for being with us today.
Really glad to be here, Valerie. Thank you very much for having me on the show, and I'm looking forward to an enjoyable conversation.
Well, thank you. We are too. We are too. This is a subject I heard about not terribly long ago. And the more I learned about it, I thought, gosh, I know there's a lot of people that don't know anything about it. And we all struggle with ways. We all think we could be wealthy. We all wish we knew what smart people know about how to manage their investments and their taxes. And so I wanted more people to know about DSTs. So thank you very much for being on. Scott, many people don't know where to start when it comes to choosing a financial advisor. So let's start there. What should they be looking for?
Well, I think one of the first things that somebody should consider when hiring a financial advisor is understanding what are the advisor's strengths and where are their conflicts of interest they should be considering.
Okay.
Um, one of the things I pride myself on is being a fiduciary to my clients, which means I am obligated to work in their best interest, not only from a legal standpoint, but just that's the way I've always approached working with my clients. And so when you're talking to an advisor, one of the things you want to know is, are they a fiduciary? And what are their conflicts that may exist in anything that they may be recommending to you?
Okay, so let's just go back there. So first of all, define fiduciary. I understand being in real estate also what that means, but let's explain to people because they're driving their cars or they're busy, they're listening. What is a
Sure.
fiduciary? What does that mean?
Well, there are different types of advisors. If you're operating in a fiduciary, you're acting in a fiduciary capacity where you're obligated by law, from a legal standpoint, to uh, to make recommendations to your client that are in their best interest, purely in the client's best interest. Um, from a uh, Opposed to that would be acting purely from a brokerage standpoint, where you would make recommendations that were suitable for your client, but maybe not necessarily in their best interest. And so the way the regulatory environment has set it out is you either act in a fiduciary capacity where you're obligated to act in your client's best interest, or you're acting from a brokerage standpoint purely from a it's suitable for the client's uh, best interest.
Well, wouldn't we want to think that everybody acts in the best interest of their client?
Well, I think we would always think that way, that we would always want that, but the law is very specific between the two, and so that's part of the way I run my business, and I hope that that many of my colleagues in my business would think about it is operating purely in the client's best interest. Yes.
Well, there are so many financial planners. We see commercials on TV. We hear commercials on the radio. I see Facebook ads come through my Facebook and my internet, my phone all the time. How do you know who to trust? How can you possibly know who to trust?
Well, I think ultimately, there may never be a regulatory environment that would tell you exactly who you could trust. I think ultimately, when you interview a potential advisor, what you'd want to do is not only talk to them and understand how they work with their clients, and do you feel that you have a good personal relationship with that advisor, but also you may want to talk to some of their other clients from a referral standpoint and see if they'd be willing to share some of their experiences of how they worked with that advisor and see if that's a good fit for you. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, there's a lot of very intelligent, capable advisors out there in the business. You want to know that it's somebody that you can trust and that you have a personal connection with, who can be working in your best interest.
So some advisors are on commission.
Yes.
Some are on fee, what's called, I think in your words, fee-based, and there are some that are fiduciaries. So can you just tell us briefly what those terms mean?
Sure. So an advisor who's compensated on a commission basis is by definition, there's a transaction and they're paid a commission for that particular transaction. On the other side would be a fee-based advisor who would be compensated from a fee standpoint, whether that be a fixed fee or a percentage of assets under management, who would be managing a portfolio of securities of some type, and they'd be paid a percentage of those assets under management as their compensation. Now, typically, as you mentioned, a fiduciary advisor would be compensated on a fee basis. And my position isn't one is better than another. It's just important to understand the differences and always understand, for the advisor that you're working with, is their compensation appropriate for the value that you're receiving for the advice they're delivering.
And is there kind of a level of assets you would say that people need an advisor? Because we have things like oh, you have the different companies who say, well, we don't charge commissions at all. I don't want to use any names online, but we don't charge commissions at all. And some that just don't discuss commissions, and somewhere you say you need an advisor, come in and meet with us. So what if I'm just someone who I certainly don't have $1 million to invest, but I really want some advice. So are there different types of advisors that are better suited for different levels of assets or wealth, you would say?
Yes, I would say so. I think the most important component of all that is, if somebody needs help in putting together an investment portfolio or a retirement plan, um, identifying an advisor that makes sense for them is the most important part of that. So if they've got $25,000, it may not make sense to hire a boutique wealth management firm for $25,000. And therefore, it may make sense to hire an advisor who works on a commission basis to get the advice that you need. Conversely, if you've got $1 million or $2 million, you may have the opportunity to hire a more sophisticated wealth management organization to help you with that investment portfolio. Ultimately, at the end of the day, the question is, if you need help managing your money, whether you have $25,000 or $2 million, there are a variety of options out there available to you to be able to help you with those day-to-day decisions.
Yes, and we know that that's what our show is about, is always ageless, and people who are in their older years, and me included. I don't know about you, but certainly me included. And we need some advice because situations change, and we're going to talk about some of those. So what would you say is the difference between, because maybe some people just aren't familiar with these terms. So what's the difference between a wealth manager and a financial planner?
Well, I don't think there's a great, those are kind of murky definitions.
Are they?
Specifically, a financial planner, many would carry the Certified Financial Planner designation or CFP,
Mhm.
which means they've gone through education and testing to earn the CFP designation. Um, uh, a wealth manager tends to have a broader outlook, not only on the financial planning standpoint, but also from an investment standpoint about somebody's overall financial situation. So at the end of the day, I think the biggest question is, have you identified someone who you trust and feel like is working in your best interest to help you achieve your financial objectives?
Well, I would say that that's a good thing, and certainly that's what we hope people do when they hire us also. So how does a financial planner help people navigate life's transitions? Because we know, and again, with our show Always Ageless, that we are entering a stage of transition. People get married and they maybe don't plan so much, but then they have a child and they say, okay, so now I need to start saving for my child. And then we get to a stage where you plan for retirement, or your life changes, you lose a spouse, or you get older, you change your job, or you don't have a job, you retire, you do something different. So how can you plan for those things?
Well, Valerie, I think you described in pretty articulate detail kind of the nuances of the business of being a financial planner. I mean, when I think about how I work with my clients, what I try and do is help them identify a couple of areas. One is, where are you today? What does your financial picture look like today? And then we think about the future and what does the future look like? And when we do that, we're making lots of assumptions.
Sure.
We're making assumptions about how our lives will be, what the economy will be, what investment returns will be, what interest rates will be. So we're making a lot of effectively what I would call educated guesses. And then ultimately, as we move down the line through the calendar years, we understand that reality ends up being, in some cases, very different than the assumptions that we made. And you described some of them in your comments. A spouse dies, our income changes, whatever those changes may be. And so the way I think about it is, I try and help my clients think about a plan as we're going to assume that we're going to be wrong, and that's not to say that we're going to make errors or mistakes in the plan that we put together, but we know that the assumptions that we make in some cases are going to be very wrong. And so the real key to a financial plan is evaluating where we are today, making projections into the future, both from assumptions of how we think financial markets and interest rates and so forth will be, but ultimately, what are our objectives? What are our goals for that plan? And then allow for flexibility so that a year from now or 2 years or whatever the time frame may be, when reality turns out to be very different than the assumptions that we made, how do we make adjustments accordingly?
Sure.
So to give you an example, if I'm in Los Angeles and I'm thinking about taking a trip to Denver in February, well, one of the things I may take into consideration is it might snow in Denver
It
along
might.
the way, right? So I could lay out a great plan that the trip will take me 3 days and I'll stay in these cities along the way. Well, if there's a giant snowstorm along the way, I'm certainly going to make adjustments in how I proceed in my trip. And that's the way I think about a financial plan is we make assumptions about how the future will be, but then of course life comes along and throws us reality in many ways that is very different than how we assumed. And the key is how do we uh, how do we think about flexibility and the ability to adjust as the time goes along?
So I'm curious, Scott, you've been doing this for several years, correct?
I have 35 years, yes.
Okay, great. So I'm going to ask you a question. When you first started this and you were in training, I would suppose that your mentors or your classes or your designation made some life assumptions, right? It said to you, Scott, when you meet with people, you're going to assume this. You're going to assume some lifespan, right? And I'm curious. This is just curiosity. When you first started, was your assumptive life plan, life length of life, let's call it, different than it is now? And I'm asking that because so many of us now are living longer, and there's more of us older, and those of us who are older are living longer. So are you, and I'm asking, like, did you start out when they first said you, okay, everybody's going to live until they're 59 or 65, and now are you saying, okay, now we're seeing that we should be planning for 85 or 95?
Well, that's a really interesting question, Valerie. I think about in my 35 years in the business, when I was in my 30s when I started, um, the thing that I thought was most important was how can I optimize somebody's investment portfolio, and how can their portfolio returns be as good as they can be. And while those are certainly important metrics and still are today, what I've learned in those 35 years is that yes, people do live a lot longer than you expect they're going to, and the issues that they face are much broader than what are their investment returns in their portfolio. And while those considerations continue to be paramount in our decision making about how we run somebody's money and how that money affects their quality of life, what I've learned in my 3+ decades of being in this business is that um, there are much broader considerations about somebody's financial future than how their investment portfolio um, performs.
Okay. All right. Well, that's interesting. So let's get to the meat of the subject of why we brought you specifically here. And we appreciate all of your financial insights, but let's talk about DSTs.
Okay.
Something when I first heard about DSTs, I thought it was really interesting because it's something I didn't know about. I thought was maybe a good idea. But since then, I've heard so many people talk about it and all the unique aspects and then unique ways that it can be used. So let's start out by giving our listeners and our viewers a simple definition of what in the world is a Delaware Statutory Trust and how can it apply to them if they don't live in Delaware?
Huh. That's a fair question. And I'm with you. When I first heard about the Delaware Statutory Trust, and I'm going to just go from here calling it a DST just to
Let's do that.
keep it brief for everybody.
Sure.
Um, so a DST is a formation of real estate ownership that allows for significant tax advantages. And I'm going to come back and be more detailed than that in a moment. But the real key is a Delaware statutory trust is something that is an ownership structure for real estate that allows for tax advantaged investing. So a Delaware statutory trust, or DST, was created in 1988 in the state of Delaware, oddly enough. Delaware, which is known as a business-friendly state, um, and they created this structure that would allow for ownership of a DST for real estate, as opposed to traditional structures of corporate or partnership ownership or individual ownership of real estate. Later in 2004, the tax code was amended to allow for um, DSTs to qualify for 1031 exchange tax treatment. And so to talk about DSTs, I think it's important to cover the basics of 1031 exchange.
Okay, let's do that.
Okay. So 1031 exchange is, it's been in the tax code for over 100 years. It allows for owners of business real estate so that when they sell that real estate and they are recognizing or potentially recognizing gains on the proceeds of the sale of that real estate, 1031 exchange allows for an investor to reinvest those proceeds into another qualifying business real estate property, and therefore deferring the gains on the previous sale.
Okay, so I'm just gonna interrupt you 1 second. So you start out by defining it as a business real estate. So let's just clarify for our listeners and our viewers what it doesn't apply to. It doesn't apply to primary residences, correct?
Correct. Does not apply to primary residences. It doesn't apply to real estate that is not owned for a business purpose. Correct.
Okay. All right. And you work in ranches, I think, is one of your fond areas of expertise.
That is correct. I work in
And
ranches and um, industrial real estate and other forms of business real estate, which may include uh, residential rental properties, anything that is owned for the purpose of a business.
so is it fair to say, is it correct to say that a DST could apply to anything except your primary residence?
For the most part, yes. If you buy a piece of real estate that's raw ground and your only purpose is to sell it for a profit in the future, that does not qualify for business real estate purposes. So
Okay.
it'd be real estate that is owned and operated as an operating business, whether that be a multifamily apartment complex, a rental property, an industrial warehouse, or so forth.
Okay, so how does a DST help investors? And by investors, we'll use the broad term, anyone who has anything other than a primary residence that they want to put into this type of a product. So how does it help them? Let's just get right to it. If you
Sure.
own rental properties or other real estate or other assets, how do they use this?
Sure. So I'm going to run through quickly kind of the
Okay.
advantages of 1031 exchange, and then
All right.
we'll pivot to how a DST fits into that
Okay.
conversation.
All right.
So in a 1031 exchange, an owner of business real estate who sells that real estate and they want to defer the gains on that sale, they can enter into a transaction which qualifies under 1031 exchange, which allows them to defer the gains in the purchase of another real estate property. To do so, as part of the transaction, they work through a qualified intermediary, and in that transaction, they have 45 days to identify a property in which to reinvest and 180 days to actually close on that transaction to defer the gains on the original sale. So
Okay.
that's how a 10.
And the idea of the 1031, the purpose of doing that primarily is to defer or avoid paying taxes, at least at this time.
That is correct. That is
Okay.
to defer the capital gains on the transaction. What you're doing then is pushing those gains forward into a new transaction in which you have deferred gains that you can deal with in the future. That's
Okay,
correct.
great. All right.
Okay. All
All
right.
right.
So one of the limitations of a 1031 exchange is you've got to buy another piece of property that ultimately you have to manage, whether that's
Right.
rental property and you got to fix plumbing or fix the roof or get a call at 3 a.m. that the air conditioning's not working or whatever that case may be. Okay.
And that
So,
happened.
so how does a DST work? So what a DST is a DST is a managed real estate property and or portfolio of properties that qualifies for 1031 exchange that does not require hands-on management by the owner.
And how does
So,
that work, Scott?
so how that works is instead of selling a property and exchanging into another property that you have to manage, a DST is a property that you can exchange in, and now you're a passive owner. And instead of having day-to-day management responsibilities on that property, you have the ability to be a fractional owner of a real estate program managed by a professional management company in which you receive potentially cash flows and rental returns, but you don't have day-to-day responsibilities of managing the property. So in effect, what we're trying to do is say, instead of managing real estate day to day, you have the ability to have mailbox money from being a passive owner. Now, so that creates significant advantages, and it also creates a list of disadvantages, which are
Okay.
important to consider.
Well, let's
The
go through this.
advantages are the first and greatest advantage is you have no day-to-day management responsibilities. The second advantage is you have cash flows from the real estate program. The third advantage is you have some significant tax advantages in the cash flows themselves, in that they are traditionally tax advantaged cash flows to you. The disadvantages are you're a passive owner. You have no say in how that management program is run on a day-to-day basis. You have no capability of providing input into how that program works. Secondly, you have a illiquidity issue in that your investment in that real estate program is typically tied up from 5 to 10 years. And third, um, you don't have any say in the disposition of that property. And so your money's tied up. You don't have, I like to tell clients, you're in the back seat. You have no ability to drive the car. You are a backseat driver at that point. So the greatest advantage is you've deferred your taxes. The greatest limitation is your money is tied up and you don't have the ability to direct how that investment is managed.
Okay, so let's talk about this. So I understand 1031 exchanges or any exchanges, you take this and you do this, like for like. So a DST, I have X amount of dollars that just say, it doesn't matter, X amount of dollars that I just sold a property, my investment property. It was a duplex, it was apartments, it was a rental property, because a single family home is okay as long as it was a rental property already, correct?
That's
Okay,
correct.
so I'm gonna sell it and I have this amount of money and I want to do something with it. I'm done being a landlord, too old, too tired, too frustrated, any of those things. So I go to you and I say, okay, I want to do this. Now, a DST is a title, correct? I mean, so do you always take it to a company that manages the DSTs? Are they like I think of it in my mind, kind of like a mutual fund of properties in that way. I mean, so is there like a property manager, but they only manage DSTs?
That's correct. So there's hundreds of different DST product sponsors around the country,
Okay.
and their purpose in business and the way they structure their businesses is to help investors like you've just described, who are no longer wanting to be property managers themselves, and they want to exchange into a more passive investment program. So there are DSTs that are constructed that are single properties. There are DSTs that are constructed that are multiple properties. They may be multifamily apartment complexes. They might be industrial warehouses. They might be manufacturing facilities. They may be a portfolio of single family rental residences. So there's a variety of different types of DSTs that are available to an investor.
So what happens when this, we'll call it a manager, is that a correct word?
Yes,
DST manager. So what happens when they want to buy, do they ever change anything within that portfolio? Do
they
they?
do not. So in a DST offering, it is a very specific offering relating to the particular properties or property that is held within that trust arrangement. So once an investor exchanges into a DST, they're going to own just those properties for the life of that particular arrangement, which the maximum life is 10 years, typically turns out to be more like 5 to 7 years from a time frame standpoint.
So do they ever decide they want to sell one of them? Let's say, for example, that there's like 5 single family homes in this package, or there's 4 apartment buildings and they want to sell one of them. So then what happens? Does the manager of the DST make those decisions? Do they get to? They have to ask you?
So that's kind of that tying back to that lack of control. They don't ever ask you.
Oh, they don't. Do they notify
No.
you, or do you ever?
No, they certainly notify you, but typically a DST product sponsor is going to manage that project for the fiduciary benefit of all the investors, including themselves, which most product sponsors are investors in the program as well.
Okay.
And then what they're going to do is they're going to maximize, in their opinion, the investment opportunity for that particular project. And so in our example, if we've got a portfolio of 5 residential homes that are within the DST, that's going to be one transaction that at the end of the transaction, they're going to go ahead and make a sale. And at that point, they would notify investors and say, all right, we've got a pending sale of the entire DST asset. And now you have the ability to do a number of things. You could take cash and go ahead and pay your taxes on the cash, on the gains that you've deferred from your previous transaction. You could do another 1031 exchange into another DST, or you could do another 1031 into a physical property if you decided you wanted to get back into the property management business.
And what happens if I want out of the DST?
Um, that's one of the limitations of a DST is once you're in, and you don't have any liquidity options until the DST as a whole comes to a transaction in the future. Now, there are secondary markets where you may be able to have a transaction where you could sell your interest, but typically those come at a pretty steep cost from
Sure.
a discounting standpoint, and you'd be looking at a 20 to 40 or 50% discount in the value of your interests. So when I think about DSTs as a solution for a particular client, that is one of the greatest limitations is you need to know that effectively your money is locked up and you have no flexibility going forward from a liquidity standpoint.
So then, who is a good candidate for a DST? Or is it only for wealthy people?
No, I don't think it's for wealthy people at all. Well, I should say one of the limitations of DSTs is you must be an accredited investor. So to be an owner of a DST, you must be through IRS definitions an accredited investor, which means as an individual, you must either have $200,000 of annual income or $1 million net worth exclusive of the value of your home. Or if you're a married couple, $300,000 of income, or again, that $1 million of net worth exclusive of the value of your residence. So if you meet those qualifications from an accredited investor standpoint, what I would consider to be appropriate prospects for a DST would be anybody who is looking at a transaction on their business real estate where they're facing a significant capital gain, where they may want to no longer be a property manager, but they still want to um, uh, enjoy some of the benefits, the tax benefits of being a real estate owner and the cash flows that accrue from that ownership.
So if I come into you and I say, Scott, I'm going to sell my properties. I want to get rid of my properties. I'm so tired of being a landlord, but I have kids that I want to take care of. I want them to be able to have my inheritance. I don't want to put them in a situation that we get down to the end. I'm about to leave this earth or have gone. And now I put my children in a situation where they have to decide. They have to fight over the inheritance. They have to decide what they have to do. They have to sell the properties. They don't know whether they should sell them or they shouldn't. They don't know if it's a good time or a bad time. It's not an ideal situation. So, Scott, what should I do?
Well, without getting too complicated, there's some pretty interesting possibilities as it relates to the DSTs.
Okay.
One of those is that many DSTs, um, they have a provision called a Section 721 exchange, which allows for the exchange of the DST ownership into a broader real estate investment trust or REIT investment. And with that investment, that allows the owner to then divide interests in that ownership between different children. So one of the things I've experienced in my 35 years of being a financial advisor is that within various families, kids often have various different viewpoints about money and
They
their
do.
assets,
They
right?
do.
Yeah,
You've said
yeah.
that also. Yes, they do. They
Right.
do.
And so utilizing a Section 721 exchange allows a DST owner to divide interests in that ownership between different children, which allows then we'll call a family with 3 children. One child may choose to sell their ownership and go ahead and pay their taxes on the gains that have been deferred through their interest. While on the other side, the other 2 kids may say, I'm a little longer term thinker, and I want to go ahead and hold on to my investments. And then ultimately, mom and dad die, they receive a step up in basis, and then they sell their interests and they never pay any taxes at all from a capital gains standpoint. So the point is, there's a lot of flexibility involved with the ownership of not only DST interests, but also the 721 exchange interests that may be possible in the future.
I heard an example recently at a event I was at, a class, where someone talked about that the parent had 3 children and they purchased 3 individual properties in the DST so that each child had their own and they didn't have to worry about it. They put them all in a DST, but they were each 3 separate properties, could have been apartments or single family dwellings or whatever. Is that something you
Right.
see often?
Oh, very common. So quite often when I talk with clients about DST ownership, I don't talk about one particular property as the solution for them. But just as in an investment portfolio where diversification is important, we will think about multiple property ownership to create a diversified portfolio of real estate ownership within their DST portfolio. Now, that may be very specific in this case, as you described, to individual children, or it may be more broadly ownership from a trust or estate standpoint, where you just want to have a diversified portfolio across all ownership in the trust.
So if someone doesn't want a DST, what other investment strategies might you recommend?
Well, I mean, certainly if they want to maintain hands-on ownership of real estate and they've got a property that they feel is appropriate to sell at this point and they're going to recognize a gain, part of what they should consider would be what might be an appropriate 1031 exchange vehicle for them to work into that maybe would lessen their management responsibility, but would still defer their capital gains on that sale.
And just for the benefit of our listening and viewing audience, can you move out of one property and do a 1031 exchange into 3 different properties?
Yes.
You could do that similar, whether it's a DST or 1031, you could do it.
Sure. So one of the things that is often confusing in the 1031 exchange process is people think when they say like properties, often clients think, well, okay, if I'm selling rental real estate, I need to invest in rental real estate. Or if I'm selling industrial real estate, I
Mhm.
need to reinvest in rental or industrial real estate. That's not the case. It's really just business real estate. So you could sell a portfolio of three residential rental properties, and you could reinvest those proceeds in an industrial warehouse. And as long as you followed the 1031 exchange requirements, you would qualify for 1031 exchange and the deferral of capital gains into those new properties.
Have you
Similar,
ever seen, I'm sorry.
no, go ahead.
Have you ever seen anything that was a really unique situation where it was a 1031 or a DST where the transfer was into something unique? I mean, I heard that somebody bought a boat, a yacht as a 1031 exchange or a DST or whatever. Have you seen anything that was really unusual, especially in your work in ranches and that type of product?
Oh, you couldn't have teed me up any better, Valerie.
Really?
Thank
Well,
you.
let's talk about it.
So, so one of the things that is most interesting to me, and really how I got involved in this, is in working with a rancher here, and I'm in Arizona,
Uh,
and um, a client owned a large ranch in southern Arizona, and they actually created. They took upon themselves to create a conservation easement on
oh,
their ranch, which is effectively selling the developmental rights to their property.
right.
And in doing so, what I learned was that the proceeds from the sale of developmental rights in the form of a conservation easement qualifies for 1031 exchange tax treatment. So in this instance, we had a client, his ranch was, I'm gonna round the numbers here a little bit. His ranch was worth about $5 million. Um, and he and his wife were in their 80s. They were looking to retire, but in their words, we've been in the cattle business for 45 years. We've never made much money raising cattle, but our land is worth a lot more than it used to be. And so in this case, they were able to sell their developmental rights to a conservation organization here in Arizona for approximately $2 million. And those $2 million qualified for 1031 exchange tax treatment.
Oh,
So we were able to take those $2 million, reinvest them in a Delaware Statutory Trust, which created about a $80,000 a year income to mom and dad, which allowed the next generation of the family to come on the ranch and take over the day-to-day operation of the cattle ranch, and allowed mom and dad to retire comfortably on that $80,000 a year income.
well, how nice and what a great way to make all that come together and work for them. Yeah, what
Right,
a great idea.
exactly. I always think about how I work with my clients as being everybody has a different puzzle. And my
Absolutely.
job as a financial planner is really how can we take those different pieces of the puzzle and make them work to achieve their ultimate financial objectives.
And isn't that true that everybody's situation is so different, just in whether they're retiring, whether they're downsizing, aging in place, selling or buying a home, everybody's situation is so different. So many of our listeners and our viewers certainly worry about running out of money in their retirement years. What are some strategies that you suggest? What are a few tips that you could give to them?
Well, ultimately, I think the most important thing is take a fair valuation of where you are today. You know, where do you sit from a where do you sit from an asset standpoint? What does your balance sheet look like as a family from an assets and liability standpoint? And then, okay, what does our cash flow standpoint look like going forward? And then how do we mesh those two together to say, what are our objectives going forward? And how do we make decisions as it relates to those not only assets but liability in a way to achieve our ultimate objectives.
And
And
here in California, excuse me,
Mhm.
so many of us have become, just by pure coincidence and by the luck of where we live, have become real estate. I wouldn't say rich, but certainly have increased our portfolio in the world of real estate. And so many people are cash poor and real estate rich. And that's a good and a bad situation. Certainly, there's people who have, everyday people who would not otherwise have the opportunity to save $1 million, but we've got it because our properties went up in value. They've lived there a long time. Their property's now worth $1.5 million. They've got it almost paid off. And what a great situation to be in. So how do you help them balance financial security with enjoying life? They'd love to sell their house and travel. They say, I'm not going to live very long. My mom's 105. I may live to be 105. I can't assume I'm going to pass away when I'm 75 or 85. So how do you talk to people about that? What can they do?
well, first of all, Valerie, I hope you live to be 105 as well.
Thank you. And I hope
Somebody,
we know each other then.
we need people with your energy on this earth, so I
Yeah.
hope you're here for another 35 years.
Yeah.
Um, well, part of the thing is just understanding what your options are. I mean, I think that for somebody in their particularly in their residence that has built up significant real estate values, um, the idea of reverse mortgages is something to consider. Um, it for many years people thought about reverse mortgages from a very negative standpoint. I
Yes,
think
absolutely.
in the right instances, it can be a real a godsend for many families to help them recognize the equity that they have in their residential real estate and take advantage of that from a retirement income standpoint. The other part would be just, understanding, all right, what are my options? And as we talked about earlier, and thinking about hiring a financial advisor or somebody who can help put the numbers together for you to help you understand where are you today, where do you want to be, and what's the path to get there.
Yes, that's important. But we know, and certainly where we grew up, I mean, we were, my dad was a plumber. All of our friends were steel mill workers in northern Indiana. And um, so they didn't have the money to save. We just weren't not that kind of a lifestyle. But now we're in this situation where people are living longer, and so many people feel like they're starting too late. We sit here and we talk about today about wealth management, or you should save for retirement, or you should do this. Well, some of them say, I'm already 65. So what can people like that do? Reverse mortgage, I think, is one of the most misunderstood and underused retirement tools. But what else are people? Is it too late? Is there a time when it's too late to save or to plan for retirement?
Well, I don't think so. I always like to think about when I work with clients, I like to think about how are we going to look forward? How do we evaluate where you are today and how can we maximize your opportunities going forward? And, part of that is understanding that we're not going to try and hit a bunch of home runs. We're going to try and build a diversified portfolio that helps you be most successful going forward, given your circumstances, what your cash flows are, both incoming and outgoing. And then how do we build a plan around that to help you get, and how do you get to manage your day-to-day expenses going forward?
And I'm sure you run into situations where the children and the parents come together, and the children sometimes have to bring the hard and fast rules to the parents that, we need to plan. And we're doing a lot of videos now about um, parents and older at the aging children, adult children of aging parents need to figure out that we've got a plan for some kind of care situation. We're all going to need something. We all want to live in our current homes forever, but most of us don't end up staying there. So what do you do when families come together, and how do you have those hard conversations with them?
Well, one of the most interesting part of my work is the family meeting, and I think it is not only one of the most difficult, but also one of the most rewarding parts of the work that I do,
That's
in
good to hear.
having multiple generations in the same room talking about these types of issues. Um, whether it be a very wealthy family talking about how they want to divide their estate going forward. But more importantly, quite often it is not a wealthy family. It's a family talking about the issues you've just described, which is, okay, we have a specific set of resources, and mom or dad may or may not need these kinds of resources going forward from a long-term care standpoint. How do we best allocate and anticipate what those requirements are going to be so that mom and dad are in good shape going forward?
So as we wrap up our show today, and we thank you again so much for coming and sharing this information, I think DSTs is another product that's so misunderstood, and just mostly because people don't have any information about it. So
Mhm.
what is one bit of advice? We have just a few minutes left. I'm sorry to say, but we can have you back again. So what is one bit of advice you would want to give to people who maybe they haven't done any planning, maybe they've done a little, and of all of your experience of the things that you've seen and heard and been involved in, what would you like to pass on to our listeners and our viewers?
I would just say that whether it's a piece of real estate or an investment portfolio, um, that no investment decisions should be made within a vacuum. Ultimately, if you can make those decisions in the context of a broader plan for you and your family, and you can ultimately come up with a better decision um, as it relates to that transaction. So whether that be the tax deferral that is beneficial to you from a 1031 exchange and a DST, or it may come from just the communication that occurs between you and your kids and your grandkids about your estate planning. Um, ultimately, thinking ahead and anticipating what the possibilities may be, and then building into that plan the understanding that the future will not likely be what you assumed, can make for a better situation for everyone.
And unfortunately, I know all of our guests say the answer to that is always plan ahead. And one of the saddest things I know you and I both see is people who would have been so much better off if they just would have planned a little bit and just didn't know where to go. So that's where you and I want to be resources. And we want you to know that your information is going to be showing on the bottom of the screen and people can reach you. How can people find you, Scott?
People can find me. My website is westernskiesadv.com or 480-652-9422. I have clients all over the Southwest and would be happy to entertain questions or comments. Um, the first consultation is always at no charge.
Well, that's good. It has been an insightful conversation, Scott. Thank you so much for breaking down these financial topics in a way that makes sense for everyone, no matter where they are in their journey or their level of sophistication or involvement in the financial markets. But if today's discussion got you thinking about your own financial future, to our dear listeners and our viewers, take action. Whether you're considering a DST, whether you're curious about it, you're looking for a great financial advisor, or just want to make some smart money moves and you're not quite sure where to start, now is the time to start. So if you did enjoy this episode, please go to our YouTube channel, which we have down at the bottom for you. Be sure to subscribe, follow, and share with anyone. And be sure to come back next Monday for another episode of Always Ageless with Valerie V. And this is where we help you to learn to live boldly, not old, but be old, not old, but bold. Thank you very much for being our guest today, and we will see you again next Monday.
Cheers. Thank you, Valerie.